Good morning, everyone. Good morning or good afternoon, good evening, wherever we find ourselves in the world today. I'm personally on the West Coast in Portland also. Hey, Jerry. But hello to everyone, especially those of us in the States coming off of what might have been a long holiday week. If you're still kind of shaking the dust and remembering how to get into a professional mode, we're glad that this is going to be one of those first things on Monday that gets you into it. I threw it in the chat, but if you could all start taking time to introduce yourselves in there. I see some people doing it. And our opening question is kind of what brought you here today? Thank you. My name is Kenny Andrzejewski. You all should have been receiving emails from me, and I'm the events lead here at New Public. And I've been working with them all of us in our community, to create digital public spaces around our Trust magazine. And that's kind of what New Public primarily does. And it's a really cool opportunity for us to kind of put our philosophy and our thoughts and our approaches into practice by holding this digital public space together. I want to do a quick overview of the agenda for us. Welcome, here we are. We're going to go over our signals really quickly today because they're actually going to be kind of the framework that we go through in this conversation. Wilfred's going to introduce the trust issue. We're going to have our mini panel, and then we're going to have a series, or really two breakout sessions today that are going to allow us to connect in smaller groups on our personal experiences and in our ideas. The first, well, here's the signals. We have 4 of them. This is what a lot of our research, knowledge and network building has been based on, and just listening to people in terms of how we create healthy digital public space. We have welcome, connect, understand, and act. And the first one we're going to focus on today is welcome. This is basically going to be our group agreement for the time we spent together today. So you can see we want to invite everyone to participate. We want to ensure people's safety. We want to encourage the humanization of others, and we want to keep people's information secure. So a lot of those are ground rules that you probably touched upon in different group settings before, but we like to apply them in the spaces that we hold, hoping that it can create a really conducive environment for all of us to share and connect with each other. And before we move on, I actually want to open up. Going to stop sharing, going to bring us all back into the screen. I want to open up the floor for anyone who wants to share why they showed up today. If you want to expand upon what you wrote in the chat, or if you haven't written in the chat yet, you want to add any flavor or any perspective to our group so far. Feel free to raise your hand, or if you're the first one to jump again, come off of mute.
I'll jump in. So I believe for quite a long time now that trust is crucial for the operation of our society, and that it's a generally unrecognized aspect of society. If you look at companies like Google and Amazon, they couldn't function. It's actually the largest unrecognized asset on their balance sheets, is that whatever trust they're able to engender. And currently, I'm interested in 3 very complex, but I think highly interrelated problems, which are the climate crisis is a fundamental issue of our time, I believe. But in order to solve that, we have to deal with the democracy crisis that we're currently getting more deeply in. And in order to deal with that, I think the social media and media in general issue has to be dealt with more effectively. So all those things depended tremendously on trust. So that's kind of where I'm coming from.
Thank you for sharing, Jeff. Would anyone else like to contribute to the space to start us off today?
I'll go if nobody else is going. Hi, everybody. I'm Michael Preston. I run the Joan Gans Cooney Center at Sesame Workshop. We're involved in a couple of initiatives that I think align really well, and I'm eager to learn from folks here on the call. One area is we're working with the Corporation for Public Broadcasting on meeting the needs of tween and teen audiences who are currently not particularly served by public media in the US. And a lot of that is getting feedback from young people about what they hope for media in the future and what their current practices are and ways to educate the sector about what those are and sort of build some bridges and start some new pilot projects. And so underlying all that, I think, is partly an infrastructure for public media to think about that's different from broadcasts, and more participatory ways of working with kids. So that's one key thing. Otherwise, also just well-being in general as an outcome is an area we're exploring how to design better digital spaces. Thanks all.
Thank you, Michael. And then whoever has their hand raised.
Hey, that's me, Sarah. I'm calling from France, but I'm really from Brooklyn. So this is the background of an Airbnb, just FYI. But I am really interested. I started the Freelancers Union, and I have really been looking a lot at how we start to build real organizations that actually have collective activity and not thinking of it as a corporate strategy to build something that helps the business. And I find that when I'm talking to people in the social sector, there's kind of one view of trust and solidarity. And even when it's sort of progressive technology people, it feels often like a lot of the assumptions are sort of baked in from some of the for-profit strategies. And so it's not even like I see a disagreement, it's like this. And I don't quite understand that. And so I'm really looking to figure out like, what's the bridge and how do we get there?
Wonderful. Thank you. And you said Sam? Is that right?
Sarah.
Okay, so
No, I have to rename myself.
Sarah.
I have.
Okay.
Let me
Sarah.
do that right now.
Thank you, Sarah. I was gonna try to pronounce that, but I don't.
It could be Sam. It would be interesting.
Wonderful. Well, thanks everyone. There's gonna be opportunities to contribute in your smaller groups and further out. But with that, I actually want to hand it off to Deepti to give us a bit more of a new public introduction and broader framing.
Hi, everybody. Welcome. I don't want to take too much time except just to extend a welcome to all of you. This is the third of a series of these conversations we've had, and we've really enjoyed each one of them as a way to dig deeper into some of the questions it is that we're holding as an organization as we think about what the design of healthy digital public space could look like. And I think most importantly, in relationship with all of you. Some of you we know well on this call, and others are new to us. And so really, really excited about kind of how this conversation will unfold over the next year and over the next year and a half, over the next hour and a half. I guess we could hold this conversation for a year and a half too. And really, Caroline, Morshad, and Primavera, thank you for your contributions to the magazine. And as the chat thread is already showing, like your work is really kind of like a North Star and guiding light for us. And so feel really grateful to be able to kind of dig into these topics with you and with your leadership. So with that, Kenny, I think I hand it over to Wilford, right, to kick us off on the magazine.
Hi, everybody. So I'm Wilfred. I edited the trust issue of the magazine. Just a very quick introduction to the magazine. It has 11 stories. It just came out last month, and you can check it out at newpublic.org/magazine. We're also going to send you our free ebook version, which is very pretty. Basically, we try to look at questions around technology from a lot of different angles. It's a very interdisciplinary publication. So we came, to this idea of trust as a fundamental, and as one of the attendees mentioned in the introduction, it's kind of an overlooked question when it comes to technology. The thesis being that trust really is at the heart of a lot of the other questions that we're asking. Our last issue was about decentralization, so you can check that out as well. And so today for this event, we're trying to emphasize the connect building block of our signals framework, and that's really building bridges between groups making power accessible, trying to not just be talking to ourselves, but reaching out and making this interesting among new friends and our community. So I'd like to introduce our panelists today. We have Caroline Sinders, who is a contributing editor to New Public and a machine learning researcher. Matthew Pruitt, who is the president of Radical Exchange. We have Primavera de Filippi and Morshed Manan, who are blockchain researchers and contributed jointly to a piece about why blockchain poses interesting questions about the difference between trust and confidence. Yeah, I guess we'll just jump into the discussion. Basically, I wanted to give the authors a chance to quickly explain their pieces in the magazine, just so we kind of have a groundwork for the discussion today. So Caroline, I wanted to start with you. You wrote a piece about transparency and what it means and why it matters in machine learning. So I was wondering if you could introduce yourself real quick and just give us a TLDR about your piece.
Sure, yeah. Thank you so much for having me, everyone. I'm really excited to be here in conversation with you all. I am a design researcher and a technologist, and I also am a teacher. I work a lot with master's students in London, the United Kingdom, where I'm based. And one of the things I've sort of noticed across the past few years is this trend towards ethical and equitable technology, but the sort of overuse of those words, and I would argue in a way, a kind of lack of critical engagement at time with those words has kind of rendered them really flat. One of the things I strive to do with my students is get them to rather define and sort of express and clearly show, well, what is ethical technology to them? And transparency is another thing that gets brought up a lot. Well, things should be transparent. Systems should be transparent. Well, what is transparency actually? What are like the steps, and what are the steps or the ways that you would actually show or engage with transparency? So the goal of the piece was to really define, as we said in the article, what is meaningful transparency. So it's not enough simply to open source code. I argue you have to make it sort of legible for all different kinds of users, including, one could argue, a common user. So if you're engaging with a technical process, is it explained in a way where a non-technical person could understand it? And then the second step is auditability. Have you explained all the processes and all the different aspects of the technology or code base you're working with in such a way, in such an understandable way, that someone can have an opinion about it, that they could audit it, that they could sort of provide any kind of feedback? And you can use a variety of different ways, I think, to sort of explain a system. You can use data visualization. You could use like plug and play options. There's a variety of different things. It's not just even plain language. And then the last step, sort of building on those two, is a space for impact or interaction. So if people have an opinion, where do they place it? How often do you respond to that? How do you, do you have a transparent way, one could argue, of responding? Is it a forum? How often do you respond to those questions? How do you determine how to respond to a question? I think all of those things do actually need to be sort of engaged with and shown. And then if you're going to sort of place a processee or a technology online, you're going to talk about or reference successful use cases. Are you providing enough information that we can see why and how they were successful? So I think a lot of this is trying to confront what I think about that is sometimes a failure in the design space, is this sort of overly optimistic speech we engage in that doesn't actually have a lot of specificity to it. So that's kind of the crux of the article. Yeah, thank you.
Awesome. Thanks, Caroline. I'm going to hand to Morshed and Primavera to talk about your article and give us a sense of who you are and what the argument you were making in the pieces.
Thank you. Yeah, so we're gonna each present a little piece. So I'm Primavera de Filippi. I'm a researcher at the CNRS and faculty associate at the Berkman Center at Harvard. And pretty much all my research for like many years now is focusing on the legal question and governance aspect of blockchain technologies. And So this piece is a piece that builds upon a previous paper that we also co-authored with Morshad, which is presenting blockchain technology as not just or not a trustless technology, because this is kind of like trying to define something by saying what it is not, but rather by defining it as a confidence machine. So something that provides some kind of technological guarantees, and that we can be confident that because something has been codified in a particular manner, then it's going to operate exactly as planned. And so what we suggest is that it is perhaps more useful or more informative to address this question of blockchain technology with the frame of confidence. And then, of course, we also analyze further the question that, of course, confidence can never be full, and there are some preconditions in order for this confidence machine to actually be a proper confidence machine, and this requires looking into the guts of the technology. This requires actually looking at the governance structure that might or might not actually be sufficient to ensure that we can be confident in the way it operates. And so basically the whole idea that yes, we can try and replace trust with confidence, but confidence and trust are inherently contextual, and we need to account of the context in order to be able to understand whether we can indeed trust or that we can indeed rely on the confidence provided that is by this technology. And so we wrote this piece as a way of illustrate those concepts, and I will let Morshad go more in details.
So our idea or sort of inspiration for this particular piece, building on our earlier work, was considering this example of the slot machine and how there are interesting parallels between those who tried to hack or exploit slot machines in the past over several decades, and those who are now trying to exploit different experiments and different initiatives that use blockchain technology. And so we try to juxtapose the example of Tommy Carmichael and his invention of the monkey paw to exploit a slot machine with the sort of anonymous, but perhaps now known, based on a very recent Forbes investigation, hacker of the first decentralized, or supposedly the first decentralized autonomous organization called the DAO. And so we use that to try to begin our discussion about whether either of them are trustless or not, or whether instead they rely on confidence. We go into a discussion on this now well-known example of the DAO and what was the idea behind the DAO and how smart contracts in a way operate mechanically like slot machines in certain ways, and the impact that the hack of the DAO had on the notion that these systems are trustless at all or not. And so what we then show is that instead of these systems actually being trustless, trust continues to be an important role. But as we argue, and as Primavera has mentioned, confidence is actually what is needed for these systems to operate. And then we go into the literature briefly here, but more extensively in our article about how trust should be distinguished as a concept from confidence, and how authors like Niklas Luhmann have made this distinction in the past when, for instance, distinguishing, for instance, trusting a lawyer versus having confidence in the legal system. And using this and extrapolating from this to understand how blockchain networks operate as well. The last part of our essay goes into the difficulty of actually bringing trust back into these systems. So we talk about different examples that blockchain networks have been experimenting with. So ranging from nonprofit foundations and trusts to very elaborate voting structures as ways of trying to deal with what you could call as this issue or the problem of trust. We talk about Dash, we talk about this decentralized social networking platform called Steemit, and the fact that those were not necessarily able to resolve all of the trust issues that arise, and in fact, in some cases, created new ones. And so our overarching takeaway that we hope the reader will take away from this is that the attacks and these sorts of efforts at trying to game the system in a way can be both a curse and a gift. So on the one hand, of course, we learn how these are very fragile systems, that we learn that there are some of the illusions are shattered, but on the other hand, it also gives us the opportunity to try to look behind this facade and try to work and build more resilient systems as well. That's would be the sort of main summary of our paper.
Great, thank you so much. So I want to do something and kind of try to put both your pieces into conversation with each other, because both pieces are really trying to define these big ideas that people tend to throw around, right? Transparency and trust and confidence. So, maybe I'll start with Caroline, which is, how do you see this dynamic, this slippage between confidence and trust maybe playing out in the argument that you're trying to make about transparency? And, feel free to kind of interpret that or go wherever you want with that question. And then at the end of this, I'd also love to bring in Matt and get your reaction as well, just to the conversation that we're having here. But let's start with you, Caroline.
Sure. I'm not sure how much I can totally engage with the confidence part of that question, but I think one thing I will say is, having worked in industry and now working in civil society and more in academia, I do understand in a way the opacity that comes with working for a for-profit company. I think that being said, the argument of what I was trying to make still stands, that there is a lot of kind of obscure languages or reference or sort of gestures at, let's say, the examples that the piece is digging into, more specifically Google's Perspective API. And on one hand, one can understand how the specific case studies of the partners, that there's a lot of missing information one would need to really understand how well Perspective worked, like how well did it work for the New York Times, for example. But there's probably a lot of NDAs in place for that, so we can sort of see why specific information of how many content moderators actually used this, what was their day-to-day like, how successful was it, what were complaints they had, what were things they liked about it. That kind of specificity, I argue, is extraordinarily important in terms of understanding, right, or engaging with the word transparency, in terms of how well or well not this thing works. So I think sometimes when I think of the word trust, there is a lot of trust us that comes from for-profit companies, in the sense that they cannot disclose everything. And so while I understand, like, if I'm putting on a very realistic hat, I do understand that, like, not everything can be shared. But I think that then comes with the response that I don't need to trust you. Why do I have to trust you? Why do I have to believe sort of in good faith of this argument, right? And so I think this is where this definition comes with. And I think the thing I sort of the argument I wanted to make in that piece was, it's not enough to simply share some things. It's not enough to simply like have some open source code. There's a lot of other things we would need to see to also determine how well this works or does not work. And so I don't want to trust you, and I don't have to trust you. I'm allowed to ask for these more things. And I'm also allowed to craft a definition, right, of transparency, and then say, this is my definition of meaningful transparency. This is my argument. And this is how your disclosures do or do not stand up against that. And that's kind of the point, right, of any kind of argument, research, and rhetoric, right? Isn't that sort of the point of engaging with new or affirming different kinds of definitions? So I think perhaps relating to your point of trust and confidence, I am really interested in how there are arguments crafted around opacity, and that sometimes the response is, well, you should just trust us. And I would like to say, why? Or where is the evidence or proof that I should? Yeah, that would be my response.
Cool. Throwing it back to Morshed and Primavera, any response to that, or how do you see that the role of transparency, you know, in the argument that you're trying to make?
Maybe I can jump in. So I think, yes, definitely. And that's kind of like the motto of the blockchain is like, don't trust, but verify, which is based on the concept that it is possible to verify. And therefore, I don't need to trust those operators because everything has been proved and recorded in an immutable way. So transparency clearly play an important role in our when we're addressing the question of confidence, for sure. At the same time, there are things that even in a blockchain, there are things that we cannot verify, or at least that we cannot verify in advance, and that's all the question of governance. Right, so you can verify that specific records that have been inserted in the blockchain cannot be modified. You can verify that everything is actually going according to the protocol, but there is the underlying governance which is not verifiable. And I think perhaps one very interesting aspect that disclose this issue, I think, is what is happening recently with maximum extractable value. So the miners that all of a sudden are appropriating the transactions that have been submitted to the network, and when that transaction is actually a profitable transaction, because the miners are the ultimate decider of which transaction are incorporated in the block, then they take this transaction and then they emit the exact same transaction on their own behalf, so that, for instance, if there is an arbitrage opportunity or whatnot, they get to extract that value, even if they are not the one that actually found this arbitrage opportunity, and the one that actually submitted the transaction to the network does not have any return on the work that they have done. And this is interesting because it is not violating the rule of the protocol, and it is not possible by just looking at the blockchain to know that this transaction has actually been illegitimately, if we can use the word illegitimately, appropriated by the miners. And so once again, this transparency also creates a problem, because the reason that the miners can appropriate the transactions that are submitted is because all those transactions are submitted publicly into the collective mempool, and so anyone that has access to this mempool can look and can search for good transactions and resubmit them either with a higher transaction fee, so that the miner will publish it, or actually let the miner appropriate them. And so once again, this transparency is also not this kind of like conundrum into just because it is transparent, there is confidence. Again, we need to contextualize and look at what is the consequence of transparency. And it has a lot of positive consequences, which is like we can verify all the history and all the track of the transaction. But this transparency also comes with a cost. And this cost is that it's somehow enabling people to manipulate or to, I guess, co-opt some of the functionality of the network without actually violating them. And so therefore, you cannot verify, there is no transparency about the violation, because there is actually no violation. And yet the transparency makes it possible for people to appropriate the value from others.
Morshed, any quick thoughts to add on to that?
Yes, I don't want to add, very much to this. I would just add that I think the transparency aspect also shows the potential and limits of why anyone would want to use a blockchain as well. So I think like one example that I see in a lot of developing countries like my own in Bangladesh is that there is this interest in using blockchains for land registries or different sorts of registries. And I think the limits that we realize with transparency is that what transparency means in this context. So yes, maybe you are able to see, who owns what and whether some people are owning certain properties. But the limitation of it, of course, is, who is getting to actually input that data into a blockchain that is perhaps permissioned and still controlled by a corruptible land registry. And so you still have this garbage in, garbage out problem, even if it is transparent. And so I think these are the types of issues that we are still confronting, even when we think of some of the use cases of this technology, but also, as Primavera mentioned, in terms of thinking of the underlying governance of these technologies as well.
All right, Matt, I'm really curious to hear what you're thinking as you listen to this conversation. Any themes that you're pulling out or questions that you might have?
Yeah, so a few thoughts. Potentially introducing a slightly different framing is that, I mean, I think one thing that interests me about blockchain technologies and similar things is the question of what role they're playing in the basically like the formation or the dissolution of associative communities, which is basically kind of a term of art. And what I mean by associative communities are essentially the kind of communities that can ground moral obligations to one another. So this is connected to the idea of trust, because so for example, I wonder whether, I think an interesting question is, do we have a moral duty not to hack a slot machine, right? And if not, if yes, why? If not, why not, right? And do we have a moral duty not to try to hack a supposedly trustless blockchain system? And I think this question about our moral duties is closely connected to the question of whether we're talking about trust or whether we're talking about confidence, and it tells us something about whether the system that we're participating in is it is or isn't helping to sort of form some sort of new associative community. And the reason I think that that's such an important question is because I think basically that's where the interesting stuff happens. That's where the interesting stuff could happen. So, for example, if blockchain technologies are kind of like a vector that creates new moral obligations to one another in virtue of our participation in these systems, then they really start to look like something that changes politics, that changes the social organization in a really powerful way. Otherwise not. So I guess I'm interested in sort of that aspect. And I think that this question of like moral obligation between the participants in the system is a good window into that.
Yeah, and thank you so much for that, Matt. And that's interesting when I think about Caroline's piece as well, because with the example that Caroline gave in her piece, it's about Google asking people to trust that their machine learning tool for filtering comment sections in news organizations is going to do what it does, but they're being very opaque. And so there's the question of what's the implied kind of moral and social relationship between Google and everyone else in that situation, and how is that different from when we're talking about the community or assumed community in like a blockchain network. So that's really interesting. I don't know if anyone has any last thoughts, but I want to start transitioning into the breakouts where we're going to go into small groups. And so, I was wondering if we have an idea for a personal reflection question that we'd like the participants to take into the next section. What would you want people to be thinking about in terms of these questions? I'll just open it up to any of the panelists here.
I might propose simply the question of, whether you have an obligation not to hack slot machines, for example, or another a related one is like why do you trust the people you trust? Where does that come from?
And maybe if I can, I suggest also an alternative or a complementary one. I think one question that I think is interesting to explore is the question of like, what is the price of confidence? meaning that we can increase confidence, but as we increase confidence, we're also reducing flexibility, we're also reducing agency, etc. And so to which extent do we want to reach a system that is like extremely, that we can have extreme confidence on, but at the same time that does not leave any scope for freedoms and innovation, or do we rather keep that space and decide to, by consequence, decide to nonetheless rely a little bit on trust? So I think we should also not just look at confidence as this thing that is, even if it's not possible because it's contextual, but is confidence actually something that we want to seek at the maximum? And let's think about what are the collateral effects of having too much confidence as well.
If I can ask a sort of supplementary question, or think of it almost as like A and B to Primavera's question, is something like a personal reflection about whether in any of your individual lives you've had circumstances in which you've had reason to have confidence in a particular system. And this doesn't necessarily have to be a technological system. It can be expert systems like the legal system, the financial system, etc., where you didn't have trust in particular individuals, and whether that having that confidence allowed you to act in certain ways. And I ask this just as a prompt because one of the points we try to make is that in these sorts of coordinations, and I see this in the chat as well, where you have maybe mistrust or distrust within pseudonymous communities or people who don't know each other very well, sometimes you need to have some underlying confidence to be able to take actions. And that actions can be economic, but it can also be social, it can be charitable, so on and so forth. So I'm curious whether in your personal lives, you had confidence in system even when there was very minimal reason to have a trust in a particular person.
And Caroline, any extra thoughts there?
Yeah, I guess I'd be interested from hearing from participants in terms of like, maybe more specifically, what are the things you would need from much larger systems? Let's say it's like institutions, that could be governments or bureaucracies, or even really, really large companies. What are like some of the specific things you think you would need to formulate trust? And I'm always interested in specificity because I think that's one sort of the whole point of my article was what are specific definitions of transparency and how do you see that in action? But I also think then that's kind of what makes trust more meaningful. So like, what are some of the specific things beyond if we just say disclosures, like when or how many or of what kind? I think sometimes I call those building blocks. So what are the specific building blocks you would need to sort of help build that actual trust between yourself and an institution that's much larger than you and that maybe doesn't have your best interests at heart?
Awesome. So I'm going to propose that maybe we coalesce around Matt's second question, which is, why do you trust the people you trust? But with all these supplementary questions sort of bouncing around in our head as well. We have really interesting provocations from Vera and Morshed around the role and possible pitfalls of confidence, right? And then Caroline is pushing us to think about what are the practical building blocks that actually give us that sense of trust and enable something like transparency. Yeah, with that, I think we can transition into the breakouts, right, Kenny?
Yes, thank you, Wilfred. Thank you, panelists. Thank you, everyone, for being so engaged in the chat as well. Let me share screen. Cool. So we're going to go into our breakouts. And before that, we're going to focus on our understand building block. And really, this is going to be how we kind of want to conduct ourselves in these breakout rooms and as we're engaging each other on this interpersonal and also intellectual level. So we want to elevate shared concerns as we identify themes. We want to show reliable information. We want to build civic competence together, and that looks like, building up each other's knowledge bases and perspectives. And then finally, promoting thoughtful conversation, which is essentially what we hope this to be. We are going to, and this might be our big ask of the day, but we actually want you all to hang out in a Jamboard while you're in your breakouts. And for anyone who hasn't used a Jamboard before, it's hopefully really simple. But you'll land there, and if you go to one of your sections, I need to create an additional breakout room for room 5, or panels for room 5 and 6. I'll do that shortly. But we at New Public, we're making a transition from network and knowledge building to product building. And as part of that process, we wanted to really start to emerge ideas about the interventions that need to be made, especially in this conversation today. And so we're hoping to capture your ideas here. And you'll see on the right of the panel, it has the names on the stickies. We want you to have attribution to your ideas. We want to build with you. We want to like identify those opportunities for collaboration. So as you throw ideas from your reflections and from the brainstorming breakout on this Jamboard, put your name next to it so we can follow up with you. So we can figure out if there's an opportunity to build together, to work together, to grow together. But we're really hoping that the rest of our time together brings us to this point of emerging the ideas and the kind of what we're really drawn to in this moment in terms of what interventions we need to be making. So with that, this is like a big faux pas as a facilitator of offering so many different questions, but we had so many great ones emerge. So I want to offer them up. I would say for each of you in your breakouts, you're going to have members of our panel in there with you, or members of the New Public team. Choose 1 or 2 of these questions. We're only going to have about 20 minutes in these breakouts. So choose 1 or 2 of these questions to really hone in on. But for this reflection breakout, we really want you to share out your personal experience so that each of you can kind of get to know each other in the room and also get to those solutions that come from your lived experience. So I'm going to copy these in the chat in a second and then throw you into breakouts. But that will be the next about 20 minutes for us. 1 second. Getting these ready for the chat. All right, and I will send you to breakouts now. Enjoy the time connecting with each other.
This meeting is being recorded.
Welcome back, everyone. Welcome back. I hope whoever was like in the middle of a thought, you're holding that thought because we're about to return to it in a few minutes. We wanted to bring you all back to this room to kind of signal the turning point in the conversation, hopefully, to move you from that kind of expansive, reflective space, like, hey, what are the ideas at the top of our heads right now? Also want to take a pause and give anyone a chance to share out if there's anything that they're like, our group talked about this and everyone needs to know about it. But is there anything that's really top of mind and someone would love to come off mute and share out really quickly? Cool. Then we're gonna get right back into it. You all want to be in your conversation. I get it. Really quickly, our building block, our 4th and final building block is ACT. And we want to think about as we move towards action, as we move towards these ideas in this brainstorm that hopefully yields some nuggets or insights that we can really move forward with together. We really want to focus on boosting community resilience and supporting civic action. So as those kind of as girders or kind of supports in building up these ideas, we hope that you all will keep that in mind. And then the one final thing actually is for anyone who spends time in human-centered design facilitations, we're going to throw some prompts out that hopefully can move you a little bit. But one is given unlimited resources. 2 is if time and capacity weren't limitations. And 3, what is the first change you would make? Think about those as potential prompts to move your reflections into ideas, into what we can build together. So I will send you all to breakout rooms again, and feel free to continue that conversation, moving it towards ideas, or start afresh, depending on where you are at in your small group breakouts. And we'll see you back here in about 10 to 12 minutes. Welcome back, everyone. I'm sorry, I always feel so bad when I close the breakout, and I know there's a conversation still to be had. But I hope you all, especially in these last 10 minutes, if you want to shoot each other messages or throw your LinkedIn in the chat, continue the conversations, connect with each other. We very much view this as the new public community, so we want to make sure that we're threading and encouraging those connections with each other and through us as much as possible. I want to hand it back to Wilfred to close this out. So if any of our panelists want to share out, also if any of our group members want to share out, but kind of the question is like, what did you hear today? And what recommendations would you like for us to carry forward, either from your conversations or from like how your brain is synthesizing everything that you've heard today?
Yeah, great. So I'd love to bring up the panelists again, and kind of hear how your groups went. So maybe we can start this time with Matt.
Sure. We talked about a bunch of interesting dimensions of trust. One was one thing we talked about was the extent to which trust is rooted in a sense of mutual obligation. We also talked about the idea that how trust evolves, how trust can increase or decrease over time based on expectations not being met, for example, as a way of destroying trust. When people are vulnerable to each other without that vulnerability being exploited, this is a way that trust can grow. And then we also talked about how this interacts with needs to create psychological safety in group settings and stuff. So making sure that everybody is respected and that pre-existing power dynamics are like acknowledged and dealt with appropriately. Yeah, there's a lot there, but I'll stop there.
Caroline, how about you?
We actually got into a really lovely and interesting discussion about sort of the space between people and tools and how to center care, particularly around, I think, like human trauma and human response inside of platforms, and kind of dreaming about what would it look like if if companies had to spend almost every dollar they earned and like hiring, for example, facilitators and therapists and like harassment researchers and more content moderators, and we're able to spend time like actually engaging with people that had faced some kind of harm online, sort of versus the sort of faceless harassment reporting interstitial people engage with right now.
And was there a kind of action that you arrived at, of something that we could do to improve things?
I think perhaps some of the action was, well, how can you center people a little bit more inside of these technology-based systems? So can we sort of hire, I guess, more people to actually respond to this versus just thinking of it perhaps as just a tech solution?
Right. Thanks. And Primavera?
Yeah, so we had very interesting discussions. In the first breakout, we discussed the question of well, why and how do you trust, and the distinction between personal trust and institutional trust. To which extent is there a different flavor in those different types of trust, and whether one is transitive to the other? Can you trust the individual of the institution you trust, or vice versa? Can you trust the institution just because you trust the individual that the institution is made of? And then looking at like what are the various ways in which you can generate or promote more trust into an institution. And then in the second session for ACT, it's a little bit more complex because it's actually really hard to know what to do. But I think we came up with more like guidelines, perhaps, of if we were to add how to do it. And this is like the question of establishing like trustworthy identities, like making sure that we know who we're interacting with. And also like the question again raised about to which extent can we solve the problem of there not being enough trust by creating more confidence in a particular institution or system, while knowing that by the mere act of adding confidence, we lose the opportunity for trust to be established. And so in some way you have a vicious circle, because you cannot build trust anymore. So you build confidence when it fails, you need to build even more confidence. And so how to actually try to respond to this erosion of trust that we're witnessing today, not but by trying to abandon the notion of trust and therefore relying on confidence, but actually how do we re-establish, how do we re-promote trust, while maybe using some confidence in order to help the bootstrapping of the trust, but not trying to replace it.
And Morshad?
I think, especially in the beginning, I think we had a similar conversation about the distinction between interpersonal trust and system trust, as well as other sort of components of or understandings of trust that exist. But we had a very stimulating and interesting discussion, I think, about the creation of trust online, especially among like a distributed community, and whether online interactions are able to build trust in those ways. So we talked about everything from online interactions and how whether they can be a facsimile for in-person interactions, to talking about how you are able to use things like reputation to be able to try to create more confidence in online interactions, and looking at how measures to try to create more accountability or transparency might be able to encourage these sorts of interactions in low trust environments. We also talked about how whether having small social spaces would be able to bring back trust within particular online communities, and whether there can be and how this might be able to resolve some of the tensions that we have with especially when looking at commercial online spaces where there is an interest in scale and efficiency, as opposed to trying to build trust over time, as would happen offline. And so how maybe using things like smaller social spaces online might be able to deal with this. We also had a discussion about the role of particular actors, so for instance lawyers, but not just limited to lawyers, in trying to engender trust, rather than just being those who help perpetuate breaches of trust, but rather in a more positive way, how lawyers and legal frameworks can help in engendering trust. And as we've tried to argue as well, is that in trying to create also confidence. So if the legal system operates well, it can help confidence, which in turn can help engender trust. We also recommended some interesting readings from all of us, which I think we would encourage others to look at as well, from David Graeber to books on corporate persons and so on.
Wow, that's amazing. Thank you so much for sharing that. All of you, my brain is like bursting with the amount of interesting ideas that I've heard throughout this conversation that we will be following up with everyone. And before we close out, I want to hand it back to Deepti, who just has a couple of final thoughts for us today.
Well, again, yeah, same. Wilford, brain is at its limit for sure. Yeah, one, just thank you everybody for being here at New Public. For us, as we think about the design of these small social spaces, Morshed, as you mentioned, the personal also matters as we think about these like really big problems like trust and governance. And so really just appreciate everybody kind of bringing your full selves and your personal experience to this work too. It strengthens us in lots of ways. And really, I'm going to put my email in this chat, and feel free to be in touch with us as you think about collaborations. We're really thinking about how we put these ideas into action, both in the spaces that we can create, but also in research it is that we can further, and other ideas it is that we can bring to bear to the community. So thank you, everybody, especially to you, Matt, Primavera, Morshed, Caroline, for contributing to the magazine, and Wilford and Kenny for leading and moderating us. And I think with that, we're off. We hit the 10 o'clock. We hit our 90 minutes right on time. And so hope everybody has a great week.
Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks all. Bye, everyone.
Thank you. Thanks for organizing.